So welcome. And last week was our first session on surrendering the mind and its desires. And we focused on the unconscious and what Baba has said about the unconscious, as well as projection, which is a Jungian concept. So those were the areas that we covered last week. And the purpose of these sessions is to purify our hearts and minds so that we can come closer to Baba. And I just like to reiterate the purpose, because it's like sometimes we go into the weeds as we're studying the mind and psychology. And I find it very interesting that the root word psyche in Greek means soul, and yet we think of it very much as the mind. But I do like to think of it as the work that's helping to free our souls from all of the samskaras that interfere with our direct contact with God. So this week, we're going to focus on the ego and the shadow. Now, Baba had a lot to say about the ego. He's got 3 chapters in Discourses on the termination of the ego. And I've read Discourses many times, but I tell you, it just never ceases to amaze me how much profound material is in there. And I think it's because it's there for us to really absorb for 700 years. And what I really envision for these sessions is that the first half I present material that I've been studying, weaving Mayor Baba's words on the ego today with Jungian psychology on the ego and the shadow, which is a very important aspect of the subconscious part of our ego. And then, because Baba has said that in the 30s, when the Discourses were written, he was talking about how psychologists have actually been able to find the sources of conflict, but haven't necessarily found inspirational ways for us to get through all of these conflicts. And in my studies of Jungian psychology, and I am just a lay person, I have an all formal training, I do believe that much has been evolved over the last 80 years or so. And I feel it really kind of excited about exploring this and finding ways, because to bridge to God realization and Baba, because in the last chapter on the ego, he does focus on that, which is where we let the master become our nucleus for our provisional ego. So, but we're not going to jump ahead on that. And we may even spend more than a week on the ego and the shadow. It's a pretty big subject. And what I would love is for you to, if you are interested particularly in anything that I bring up, make some notes so that when we have our time for discussion, which is for the last half of our time together, I would really like to see this as an opportunity to share, just as, because we're all in this together. I'm just interested in presenting it, but I'm not an expert by any means. My background in facilitating the work of Byron Katie for the last 12 years brought me to the point of realizing that the self-inquiry work that I was doing with clients is about identifying projections, the things we project onto others, and then slowly learning how to withdraw them and integrate that energy. And that's very much about the work of the shadow. So we will spend time on the shadow today. Now, of course, Baba gives us the ultimate teaching on the ego. And as I noticed before I had the work of Byron Katie, I needed a bridge to help me live Baba's words. I had heard him speak to me in my heart when I was suffering over my daughter. This is, 15 years ago. And I heard him say, let her go. And I didn't know how to do that. And then the work came to me, the work of Byron Katie. And what it did was it showed me how to let go of my attachment. And so I think that the work with Jungian psychology also gives us a possible bridge to understanding what Baba is sharing with us in these profound, profound chapters on the ego. I feel like I've just barely scratched the surface, and I need the bridge of some of this Jungian psychological work to help me integrate what Baba is giving us. Okay, so I'm going to delve now into some of what Baba said about the ego, and then and then I'll just make some comments about it. And that'll be the first half of the presentation. And then we'll go into the shadow and we'll explore what it is and how it operates. Now, Baba didn't say that much about the shadow. And when I looked through the discourses, what he does say, which isn't specifically about the psychological meaning of shadow, but he refers to the importance of bringing up our subconscious, which is in the shadow, and all that we repress from our explicit ego. He also refers to the shadow of ignorance, the shadow of eternity, the shadow of lust or craving in the mind. And he says that the phenomenal world is the world of shadows. And that's really the umbrella statement, because this phenomenal world is a dream that we're waking up from, but how hard is that to realize in our daily life? So I'm going to just start out with what Baba says about the ego. First of all, he says the individual mind is the seat of the ego, or the consciousness of being isolated. He says the ego lives through sanskaras. So he says the limited mind is the soil in which the ego is securely rooted. And this ego perpetuates ignorance through the many illusions in which it is caught. The ego prevents manifestation of infinite knowledge, which is latent in the soul. It is the most formidable obstacle to the attainment of God. He says the ego is the center of all human activity. Okay. And then on his first chapter that's completely devoted to the ego, it's the ego as the center of conflict. So he says the first step in submitting the working of isolated impressions to intelligent regulation consists in bringing them all into relation with the center of consciousness, which appears as the explicit limited ego. The human consciousness would be nothing more than a repository for the accumulated imprints of varied experiences if it did not also contain the principle of ego-centered integration, which expresses itself in the attempt to organize and understand experience. So he says that the ego is a bunch of samskaras, and now he's also telling us that it's a gathering point. It's a point for integration of all of those complexes and impressions that we have. So it helps us to organize and understand experience. And also Jungian psychology tells us that same thing. He also says the early attempts to secure such integration are made through the formation of the ego as its base and center. The ego emerges as an explicit and unfailing accompaniment to all the happenings of mental life in order to fulfill a certain need. The part played by the ego may be compared to the function of ballast in a ship. The ballast in a ship keeps it from oscillating too much. Without it, the ship is likely to be too light and unsteady, and is in danger of being overturned by the lawless winds and waves. Thus, mental energy would be caught up endlessly in the multitudinous mazes of dual experience and would all be wasted and dissipated if there were no provisional nucleus. The ego takes stock of all acquired experience and binds together the active tendencies born of the relatively independent and loose instincts inherited from animal consciousness. The formation of the ego serves the purpose of giving a certain amount of stability to conscious processes and also secures a working equilibrium, which makes for a planned and organized life. He also says that the ego is a necessary evil. So this is just part of our journey through evolution. And it also reminds me of the work that Baba did, so often building ashrams and schools and hospitals. And he would always compare it to the scaffolding. So this outer work that he did, building these physical structures, was the scaffolding for the inner work. And I really see the correlation between that and the ego. So we have to build an ego. In fact, Jungian psychology says we have to build a healthy ego. It's really important. It's like we have to have some gift to surrender when we're ready to go on our homeward journey. And in Jungian psychology, it is said that the first half of life is about building a healthy ego. And then the second half of life is about surrendering. Now, I don't think they have fleshed it out the way Baba has. And it's something that is definitely the work that I think that will come forth over the next hundreds of years, is how we can allow this scaffolding to be removed as our wholeness comes forth in life, and we don't need the scaffolding any longer. Baba says it would be a mistake to imagine the arising of the ego is without any purpose. Though it arises only to vanish in the end, it does temporarily fulfill a need that could not have been ignored in the long journey of the soul. The ego is not meant to be a permanent handicap, since it can be transcended and outgrown through spiritual endeavor. But the phase of ego formation must nevertheless be looked upon as a necessary evil, which has come into existence for the time being. It is the essence of the ego that it should feel separate from the rest of life by contrasting itself with other forms of life. Thus, though inwardly trying to complete and integrate individual experience, the ego creates a fundamental principle of ignorance, which is exhibited in always preferring the unimportant to the important. And this is a theme that Baba repeats over and over again. It's the conversation about true values. The ego always considers the unimportant to be important. And then because of the grace of Baba, of us recognizing Baba and having him come into our life, it helps us to be able to move more towards true values. And yet I still witness that aspect of myself that does attribute too much importance to the material aspects of life. And I believe that's part of our constant surrender as we come closer to him in our life. And it's, he says God realization requires patience and longing. And last week I mentioned that Baba says that when the unconscious becomes fully conscious, God realization occurs. So we have a lot that's unconscious, and our work is to become more and more conscious. And I like to think of that as making more room in my heart for Baba, because it is painful work and there's no way about it. But as long as we, and I'm going to skip to ahead just to say that Baba gives us the solution in the 3rd chapter on the ego by allowing him to become the nucleus of the provisional ego. And so that's where we keep surrendering to him and become slowly but surely the slave of the master, because we just can't do it on our own, you know. And Baba says you can't do it on your own. Baba says that the problem of the conflict of desires turns out to be the conflict of conflicting values, the problem of conflicting values. So that's what I was just mentioning. He says an intelligent and firm choice has to be repeatedly exercised in all matters, small or great. For the ordinary worries of life are not in any way less important than the serious problems with which the mind is confronted in times of crisis. The roots of mental conflict cannot completely disappear as long as there is only intermittent exercise of intelligent and firm choice. And that's our opportunity then to continually surrender to Baba, to just notice in the moment when we're trying to solve a problem or we're forgetting to give it over to him. And Baba says that the sure sign of a real hidden conflict is the sense that the whole of one's heart is not in the thought or action that happens to be dominant in the moment. I've said this before, but this is worth repeating. Modern psychology has done much to reveal the sources of conflict, but it has yet to discover methods of awakening inspiration or supplying the mind with something that makes life worth living. This indeed is the creative task facing the saviors of humanity. And I do believe this is now happening through the movement of spiritual psychological work. There's a lot of beautiful work. And of course, Jung himself, when he was alive, recognized that the self with a capital S was the goal of life. And it's just beautiful. And, you know, there's a lot we can fill in to support us in moving more and more to that nucleus of our truest self. So Baba says that the momentous discovery that life cannot be understood and lived fully as long as it is made to move around the pivot of the ego. The false nucleus of consolidated sanskaras must disappear if there is to be true integration and fulfillment in life. So I feel like we're so fortunate, you know, to have Baba and to have all of these teachings that he left us with. And I think I opened last week's session with the idea that Baba had said he's already given us enough words. And the reason that he was silent in this Advent was because he had given us enough words, and now our job is to live them. And I feel like having this deep psychological, spiritual awareness is the way that I'm finding to help me learn slowly but surely how to live them. So Baba says the ego is implemented by desires of varied types. Failure to fulfill desires is a failure of the ego. Success in attaining desired objects is a success of the ego. Through fulfilled desires, as well as through unfulfilled ones, the ego is accentuated. Isn't that interesting? You know, that the whole umbrella concept for these sessions is surrendering the mind and its desires. And even fulfilled desires that's the success of the ego. And so becoming detached is really key in our journey with Baba. He says the ego can even feed upon a comparative lull in the surging desires and assert its separative tendency through feeling that it is desireless. When there is a real cessation of all desires, however, There is a cessation of the desire to assert separativeness in any form. Therefore, real freedom from all desires brings about the end of the ego. The ego is made of variegated desires, and the destroying of these desires amounts to the destruction of the ego. The problem of erasing the ego from consciousness is very complicated because the roots of the ego are all in the subconscious mind in the form of latent tendencies. And this is where the shadow work comes in, because that's where all the shadow is what we push into the subconscious. We repress it. And he says, these latent tendencies are not always accessible to explicit or outer consciousness. The limited ego of explicit consciousness is only a small fragment of the total ego. The ego is like an iceberg floating in the sea. About 1/7 of the iceberg remains above the surface of the water and is visible to the onlooker, but the major portion remains submerged and invisible. In the same way, only a small portion of the real ego becomes manifest in consciousness in the form of an explicit I, and the major portion of the real ego remains submerged in the dark and inarticulate sanctuaries of the subconscious mind. And it's really important to note here that we also repress our positive qualities into the subconscious. So it's not just about metabolizing our shadow, the dark shadows. It's about accepting the gifts and talents that we've brought into this life, which is just as scary, in my experience, as working with our dark shadow material. And so I think it's very important to remember that the shadow can be very positive as well as negative. It's whatever we've repressed. For example, as a child, and I'm saying this from my own experience, one of the positive things I repressed into the shadow was my creativity, because I didn't feel that the environment was conducive to my expressing it. I wasn't really given like art materials or dance lessons or a lot of the things that I wanted to do. I was allowed to do a lot of wonderful things besides just being a tomboy, playing outside and singing in the church choir and doing the scouts. But there were things I really wanted to do. And I believe that that was part of what I repressed into the shadow, was a lot of the creative expression that was really in my heart. And then on the negative side, and we're going to talk about this more, I've done inner work on the shadow of abandonment. And I'm going to share with you a Tibetan practice called feeding your demons, where we can actually communicate with the repressed shadow of abandonment or fear, sorrow, grief, whatever it is. And but I don't want to jump into that now until we finish what I have from Baba on the ego. But I love that he tells us that, you know, only 1/7 of our ego is above the awareness of our consciousness. He says 1/7 of the iceberg remains above the surface of the water. So we have our work cut out for us. Okay. The digging out of the buried roots of the ego from the deeper layers of the subconscious and bringing them to the light of consciousness is one important process of wiping out the ego. The other important part consists in the intelligent handling of desires after they gain entrance to the arena of consciousness. And this is where I feel, because he doesn't delve into the ways to do this, and I think that's where the current work in Jungian and depth psychology can really give us opportunities. And that's what we will work on today with the shadow. Now, Jung identified in his system 4 major archetypes. And the first one was the ego. So he considers the ego to be an archetype, which is an energy pattern. And that would be in line with what Baba is telling us, that the ego is that center of our impressions. There's a focus center, an organizing principle of the ego. So that's the first archetype that Jung refers to. And then he says the second major archetype is the shadow. And that's what we're going to spend some more time on today. And then he goes on, and we'll cover this in the future, but the third major archetype is the anima and the animus. Now, when he was developing these theories through all of the work he did with patients, it was a different world that he lived in than we do today. And so in his time, the woman had to work with her inner animus or male part, and the male had to work with his inner anima or female side. But today, Jungian psychology is realizing, and I believe it's true, and these are things I would love to explore with you who participate. I would love to hear your thoughts and have discussions on this, but the current awareness is that we all carry our inner female and inner male. So we all carry the inner anima and animus, and our job is to integrate them and balance them. And of course, then I think of Baba as being the perfect balance of male and female. And he talks about that, especially in this Advent. He said he's the mother and the father. And so he's showing us that's what our work is. And of course, in different religions, in Christianity, it's called the mystical marriage. You know, in Sufism, the lover beloved. Diantha and I were talking about this the other day. And of course, in Hinduism, Shiva Shakti. So it's all about the inner mystical union of our male and female sides. And then the fourth major archetype after the anima and animus, which was the third that he identified, the fourth is the self with a capital S, which I think is so beautiful, because even though he wasn't able to flesh out the path to the self, Baba has certainly done that for us. And I think that as we learn to express what he has given us in a psychological way and use some of these practices of shadow work, it will really support us in, again, finding a methodical practice that helps us work through these seemingly huge obstacles in our own psyches. You know, there's no question of the difficulty of this work for all of us. It is very challenging. Okay, so I think I'm going to leave off the third chapter, which is the disillusion. He gets into that, but I just see how our time is, and I really want to spend some time on the shadow. So let me take a sip here. So one of the things I really discovered clearly in doing the self-inquiry work of Byron Katie for many years with hundreds of clients, and I still do it, but I'm not as interested in it, because once I realized that it was about withdrawing the projections and integrating them, I got more interested in exploring that. And so what I really come to realize is that our judgments of others show us our own shadow. And we talked about this last week, and to just pay attention, and this is an ongoing practice, to just notice. The mind judges, that's what it does. It's okay. The beauty is we don't have to believe our thoughts. We are not our thoughts. We are not our emotions. We are the soul. And that's who we really are. And the more we learn to disidentify from especially the stressful thoughts and emotions, the easier it is to feel closer to our beloved. So the judgments of others show us our own shadow. This life is a dream, and our world is set up for us and has everything we need. It's our personal path to awakening. Carl Jung said, quote, "Shadow work is the path of the heart warrior," unquote. So this is the spiritual warrior work, working with the shadow. And I'm going to go into different aspects of the shadow. There are times when it's not appropriate if someone is traumatized, and I'm going to cover that. But if our ego is healthy enough to slowly wear out the shadow, then it's really worthy of our effort. So our triggers are our messengers to show us where our work is. Feeling fully the feelings that arise is enough to integrate them. And this is really the heart warrior. If you can sit with uncomfortable feelings, which is what I hold my clients in, neuroscientists have discovered that within 60 to 90 seconds, something will shift. Usually some layer of the painful emotion dissipates. Now, it's layered work, but as I've been facilitating this for years, I've really noticed that it gets lighter and easier. And I really like to remind myself and clients of that, because it just gives you optimism. And, Bob has said, that's what the psychological world needs to do, is to give us an optimism about this journey we're on, which is the most difficult journey. It's the only journey, and it's difficult. And Baba says, God realization, it's worth everything. So I'm just going to take a minute, and I want to share with you a lot of the material that I'm sharing today comes from, I found this amazing website. It's called thediamondnet.org. And this young woman named Emerald gives these fairly succinct YouTube videos on all the different aspects of Jungian psychology. And she just brings it forth so effortlessly and beautifully. And so I really encourage you who are interested in exploring Jungian psychology. She has really broken it down and made it very digestible, because the field of Jungian psychology is so vast. It's really quite something. And then some of the other material I've been using comes from a website called AppliedJung.com. AppliedJung.com. And I also find that to be very healthy. They're very spiritually oriented too. So let's just talk about archetypes for a minute. So Jung believed that we are all born into this world with archetypal blueprints. He identified 4 major archetypes that affect our individuation process, and he believed that they exist in all psyches. And for those of you who may not know, his process of individuation is really about becoming whole, merging with our true self with a capital S. So individuation is actually the journey to God. And then again, the first archetype is the ego. And this is the sense of self, and it functions as the central axis for consciousness and the integration of the shadow. So the shadow is the aspects of ourselves that we repress that can be identified through complexes. So Jung believed that the ego, being the first developmental archetype in the human psyche, was our sense of self. Most of all, we need the ego, as it is the aspect of ourself that can self-reflect. It can uncover unconscious projections and bring about change in consciousness, perspective, and behavior. It is essential to transformation, just as Baba tells us that it's a necessary evil. So Jung recognized that too. It's going to be that principle of centering that all of our impressions can gather around. So being conscious is the most important part of the Jungian journey. To be conscious means that we self-reflect and make conscious our projections, experiences, beliefs, and feelings. So the goal of the Jungian system is to become individuated. And you can replace that word with self-actualized or God-realized. This means you move more and more towards being whole, uncovering, accepting, and incorporating aspects that were unconscious into your conscious personality. The role of the ego is to use these tools and gain insight into what is in our unconscious that drives us, influence us, affect our relationships, both to ourselves and others. The ego becomes stronger and expands as these realizations are incorporated into our conscious personalities, allowing for a more flexible, self-accepting, and compassionate ego personality to emerge. Now, I would question that this makes the ego stronger for us who are following Baba, because I think we're at the point where we're wanting to surrender the ego, but we still have to heal the wounded parts of ourselves, and we still have to express the gifts and talents that maybe we did not feel allowed to express as children. So now we're going to really get into the shadow for a little bit of time here. So the second developmental archetype is the shadow. Shadow work, or integrating the shadow, is imperative to the individuation process. It's the parts of us that lie within the unconscious. A common misconception is that only negative aspects live in the shadow. When integrated, we become more mature and more whole. And this is the non-duality. You know, Baba talks about you can get too many good sanskaras just as you can get too many bad sanskaras. And I think the shadow work is what can actually help us find the middle way of balance, and also the maturity of not just being good, but of being whole. Because when we do our shadow work and we integrate the shadow, we understand all the ways people are negative, and we have compassion for it because we don't suppress our own negative aspects. We know what anger is. We know what lust is. We know what greed is. And we know that it could pop out of us at any time. But part of the maturity of this work is honoring that it's part of this whole existence that we're in, and that we're able to moderate it, filter it, and not repress it, but transform it into compassion and service. You know, when we can support others who are grappling with these issues of the human condition, it really is a bridge to wholeness. So this woman, Emerald, has broken down 4 different elements of what the ego does and what the shadow does. There's ego preservation. So the shadow exists to preserve our ego because we think that's who we are. And it's really scary sometimes to surrender something that we know isn't us, but we don't know what life feels like without it. For example, if I'm not trying to control my husband with trying to make him eat a certain way, that's a part of my identity. And this is honestly something I still work at all the time, getting out of his business and just noticing, can I withdraw that and just see how hard it is myself to take care of my body. I don't know what my body needs. It's a mystery. The second work of the shadow is the worldview preservation. Notice what you project onto the world that gives you a sense of self. When we realize that this world is actually a dream we're waking up from, and we withdraw some of our crystallized ideas about the world, then I find that it's easier to understand why Baba says that the perfect masters control everything. I mean, God has totally got this covered. Everything that's happening in this world is for our awakening. The deepest, darkest shadows are all here for a very good reason. So we have to look at our worldview preservation. Now, the third aspect is coping with trauma. And we repress into our shadow traumatic experiences that we simply cannot cope with them. And that's okay. There's no reason to bring trauma up to the surface before it's time. Okay. So if somebody has had a severe trauma, it's not necessarily appropriate for them to do shadow work on that. That will come in its own time. And then the fourth area of shadow work is unmet needs. So we also have a lot of unmet needs, usually from our early childhood years. Things like needing validation, needing nurturing. I mean, what popped up for me was needing attention. I can always remember trying to do tricks on my swing set and yelling to my parents, look at me, look at me. You know, we were 4 children, all close in age. And I realized I needed to get a sense of self. I wanted to feel like an individual. So those were unmet needs. So shadow work is the process of integrating all these unconscious aspects of ourselves into our conscious personality. It's a movement to become unique and complete individual, a person with depth and personality, who we are meant to be. And then, of course, Baba takes it to the ultimate integration and realization of our true self. So shadow work requires courage and honesty. It is painful, but always liberating. When we repress feelings and thoughts, it takes an enormous amount of psychic energy or libido to keep it suppressed. This libido is then not accessible to the unconscious personality, and consequently, we are often tired, dulled, and fatigued. Liberating unconscious content releases this trapped libido and reinvigorates the psyche. And this is certainly true in my experience. I still deal with feeling dull and fatigued at times. And I was so grateful to read this material because I've been able to just sit and notice, what is it that I'm repressing that I need to express in a positive way? So just remember that we take an enormous amount of psychic energy when we do suppress our real self, negative and positive. And of course, with the negative, we find a way to integrate it and transform it that is safe. So liberating unconscious content releases this trapped libido and reinvigorates the psyche. Another benefit is that only through consciousness can we address these feelings, thoughts, and memories and change our relationship to them. So the advantage of shadow work is that the ego becomes more flexible, more compassionate. Self-acceptance and self-care develop naturally through shadow work. It is important to note that shadow work is not only clearing out the debris and muck that lies within the unconscious, but it also contains the potential of who we are and what we are capable of. True transformation is allowing the whole person to emerge. Shadow work is turning the lead into gold. It is essential to realize that everything we experience is a projection of our internal reality. When we do shadow work, our experience of the world changes because we stop projecting onto external situations and people. As we integrate our shadow parts, the world changes. And this is when Baba tells us that the mind is a mirror with dust on it. And so we have to get the dust off the mirror of the mind in order to see the world, that it's exactly as it needs to be. So we just have a few more things, and then we're going to open up for conversation. So I hope this has stimulated you to share something, because this is all a whole new area for me that I'm discovering, and just really love to share with others who are interested in the same subject. And when I get into the persona, which I think I'm going to cover today, it's, they call it the mask, but actually this woman Emerald, who I've been watching, calls it more of the lens. So we do wear different personas in different situations, and it is appropriate. Okay. So I'm just going to overview the individuation of Jung. He believed that the first half of human development focuses on developing a healthy ego and functioning successfully in the external world. The second half requires a movement within to develop a relationship with the true personality and our spirituality. The second half of development requires shadow work before we can move on to the anima, animus, and self. So how does the shadow develop? So this behavior, we've all had caregivers, parents who did the best they could, but they obviously, we're not born with the perfect parenting manual. And so there's always situations that are less than perfect in all of our upbringings. So the behavior of the caregiver combined with our temperaments and inborn traits can develop into complexes that slip into the unconscious. These complexes have a profound impact on our belief systems, our ideas, thoughts about ourselves, and our experience and attitude towards the world and others. Often our conscious attitude will take on a compensatory position to these unconscious beliefs. For example, if you are very insecure unconsciously, you may develop a conscious attitude of being in control and being extremely rigid and demanding in your approach to others and yourself. So our biggest wounds are usually developed in our relationship with our parents or caregivers. Parents, being only human, have their complexes too. These complexes affect the way they feel and think about themselves and others. These unconscious beliefs have an impact in the way they relate to their children and the examples we set to our children. We are born with an image of mother and father, and unfortunately, very few parents can live up to our projected expectations from our parents. All of these disparities cause many complex relationship dynamics to develop. These dynamics affect how we feel about ourselves and others. We also carry these dynamics into our relationships, especially with our intimate partners. They affect our relationships with our employers, colleagues, children, and friends, as well as impacting the relationship with ourselves and the world around us. And I have found in my work as a facilitator of self-inquiry that the deepest core work we can do is on the father and mother, and that in our current life, we're usually still projecting unfulfilled needs from our childhood onto our surroundings. And it's very profound work. Okay. I think that's good for, oh wait, I have one more thing. Oh gosh. Okay, we still have a little time. This is something, again, from the diamondnet.org, where Emerald gives 6 simple steps to shadow integration. So her first step is getting to know the model of the inner universe. And this is like through metaphors, symbols, and stories. And I thought with Baba, you know, we love hearing all of the stories of Baba. And I think this really supports us in knowing the model of the inner universe. And so I feel, I don't know, I loved thinking about that, because the Mandali and Baba and all of these stories, they are archetypal stories, and they're so profound, and we all seem to be able to relate to them, you know, and we are such a varied group of Baba lovers with multitudinous personalities and backgrounds, and I just think it's amazing. So the second step to shadow integration is naming and identifying our shadow aspects. And so, for example, and I will just share with you for a moment about the Tibetan system of feeding your demons, which I found to be very interesting. So it's a visualization process. And so I did the visualization, and I saw this shadow aspect of myself. I was just a wizened, scraggly woman. And when I interacted with her through active imagination, I realized she represented my self-abandonment. There's parts of myself that I've abandoned. And so what I discovered in working with this symbol of this very unkempt, scraggly, abandoned woman was that she just needed to be acknowledged. And so I just spent time with her, and I asked her questions. What do you need? She just needed to be seen. She needed to be honored. She needed to be accepted just as she was. And it was so beautiful. And I did feel a shift. And I know that it's work I can come back to again and again. So name and identify your shadow aspects and see how that works for you. The third step is that you can identify the core need and agenda for each aspect. So just like I said, my abandoned self needed to be seen, and she needed me to look at her. The fourth step is dissolving the mental and emotional barriers to integration. So repression is maintained by the unconscious, and we can actually resolve this through meditation and through observation of our thoughts and feelings. Sometimes just being the witness and going into the observing mode is enough to dissolve these stressful thoughts and emotions. The fifth step is expanding the ego container. And for me, this is where Baba becomes the provisional ego. We're expanding the ego container. Now, Jungian psychologists don't have this awareness yet, and maybe it's something that we'll be able to share over time that will support the beautiful work that they've been doing. When we expand the ego container, we become less judgmental. And the sixth step is facilitating external expression of our newly integrated shadow aspects. And this is where our persona, which is called the mask, but I think it's nice to upgrade it to a lens. We have a social lens, we have a familial lens. We can have healthy personas that are different, and they develop naturally. So that's it. That's what I have to share today. And I'm really eager to open this up and have a conversation now. So we have 35 minutes left. And please unmute yourselves. And there's not that many, so I think you can just sort of take turns speaking up, and questions, comments, insights.
I can go first if nobody minds.
Beautiful.
First of all, thank you. And I love the last thing you said about lens instead of mask. That's great.
Yeah.
I've never heard that. It's really good.
I haven't either. I thank Emerald for that from, the Diamond Net. She's like an oracle.
Okay. Okay, I should really look into that. So I wanted to just share what I was doodling on the whiteboard while I was listening.
Beautiful. I love it.
Because the storytelling for me, I am actually one of the people that maybe I don't relate the way that most bubble lovers do. I try to boil it down more to like something more abstract, like I think of like the actual wave functions, if ever possible. So this is my idea of like the physical world here. Is this in reverse for you?
Well,
I see
I
it.
can see that we can see the circles, but I can't see this, the past the
Well,
self-ego.
yeah, okay. Well, I'll go over that,
Yeah,
but you can
yeah,
see
and
this.
hold it back a little farther.
Yeah, yeah.
There,
Okay.
that's better.
All right. I know this isn't ideal lighting. Anyway, so there's the physical world and the mental world and the subtle, right?
Okay.
And then our consciousness will be on one of these 7 sections, right? We're either gross conscious or up to the 6th plane is what he's talking about, our ego conscious individuals.
Uh-huh.
So that's the 1/7 of the iceberg is our conscious awareness of our ego. Now our ego would be made up of the wiggly bit of this of our subtle body that makes us alive and who we are and an individual. And then its resulting squiggly part of our mental body that is our delusion that we're separate from God.
Oh, I love that.
And then down here would be the physical impressions it leaves in our body language, tone of voice, the way we carry ourselves, the way what an ego does to a person over time physically changes them. So little impressions here. So then let me scroll over if I may.
That's perfect.
So the self is nothing less than, the 7th plane, right? God,
Yeah.
right? The ego is basically everything else that makes us a walking, talking weirdo person. And then the shadow is the part outside of our awareness. So it's going to be the 6/7 of this
Okay.
that we don't know about.
Yeah.
And then the animus is the sum total of the ego in either of its extreme states, because it's a wave function.
Yeah.
So the way that they alternate is often, you could look at it like male female. That's why that's where that's coming from. But it's not really a separate thing the way Jung thinks about it. It's more a state of the ego. And then the shadow is a portion of the ego. So these are subcategories. Really, it's self and ego, the way Meher Baba describe it. And then these other 2 things are Jung's way of sort of breaking down the unconscious elements of it. Okay, that's all I have to say.
Oh, thank you. I love how you've given us this graphic representation. And I just, thank you. Thank you so much. I can see so many possibilities from this creative work that you're doing. Really, I mean, I could see children's stories, as well as adult stories. But to be able to visually see the way you expressed it is so helpful. That's awesome. Beautiful. Thank you. Oh, please, everyone, feel free to share. I really want this to be an interactive opportunity for us, because I am just a layman wanting to come together and have conversations on this subject with people. Douglas, I know you must have things to say. No pressure.
I'm just kind of blown away by, is it Andrew?
Yeah.
Andrew. That was really a remarkable distillation through your lens. That was great. So I'm sort of floating around.
Well, I know it's like fresh air. I really feel like I think this is something that you can just keep running with and helping us all with bringing in this perspective that's so fresh and lovely.
Has a real clarity, a simplicity to it, but
Yeah, it's really hard to start thinking about it in terms of other people's stories for me, because then I self-identify too much with maybe it's everybody's shadow work is different, right? But to understand what it is fundamentally at first and then make sense of it personally is good, I think.
Yeah.
But so focusing on the shadow part that can't be seen, what I would say about that, I'm still focused on a place that has to do with shame, that has to do with not living up to, and that a lot of my work kind of keeps going back there. But it's like I keep unwrapping the place inside that's getting unwrapped, and by that work, and that's kind of what comes up for me. You've laid out so much here, and there's a lot to sort of get through and digest.
Yeah. And thank you.
Wonderful.
And thank you. I love that you brought up shame, and that's really a universal shadow. I have to tell you, when I found the work of Byron Katie, I was suffering tremendously. This was 2009. 2008 was when I went into the pit, the dark hole, over my daughter's problems. And so in 2009, the work of Byron Katie came to me, and I read all of her books, and I had a great intellectual understanding. And then my husband said, you need to go to the seminar. And I said, we can't afford it. I mean, we had 2 kids in boarding school, and the training was expensive, but my husband is so intuitive, and he just said, no, you really need to consider this. And so I thought about it for a few days, and I remember I had gone to bed one night, and I was just laying there. I hadn't signed up yet, but I had decided I would do it because I was desperate. And all of a sudden, I felt Byron Katie's presence. I never met her, and I had waves of shame rolling off of me. Wave. I didn't even know I had shame. Yeah. I knew it was shame. I had waves and waves of shame rolling off of me. And as I'm telling you this now, I realize it was probably related to my daughter's depression. I'm sure I felt ashamed and responsible because I was her mother, and she shouldn't have had to go through that. Right. But I can tell you, through all these years of working with self-inquiry and running workshops, especially with women, I would give workshops, and I would say 11 out of 12 women came to do the work on the mother-daughter relationship. It was just amazing. And I've really realized that the whole lineage through I'm not a man in this life, so I can't speak to it, but I think for the females, we carry this hereditary energy, and it's probably true for men too, but it's like this deep shame, like a trauma for all the things that have been less than wonderful. And so I really respect that you keep working on it and working on the shame, because it could be that deep trauma that we talked about today in the presentation. There may be something buried from when you were very young that brought shame, but and I know you already know how to work with it, and you just keep letting it arise. Every emotion can be resolved through allowing ourselves to feel it fully. And it's definitely the path of the heart warrior.
The other part, and that I'm doing or working on, and it has to do in part with effort and grace work, which is also connected here, is really giving it, and you talked about this as well, giving it to Baba, but feeling it and giving it, and then reciprocating, letting in a sense of peace or grace or love from Baba to fill that space.
Thank you for saying that. And I really think that's so important. And I feel like that's another link to the bringing the gifts that Baba's given us and bridging psychology to spirituality. What you just said, I think, is so important. The effort and the grace, and then giving everything to Baba. He wants everything. He wants our darkness. He's told us that.
Yeah.
Like, he can handle it, you know?
Yeah, it actually takes some trust to even go there, you know?
It completely takes trust. You cannot release your shame if you don't trust that it's going to go and be dissolved in the ocean.
Yeah. And
how many times has Baba repeated that he is the ocean and all he wants is for us to give him everything? And I just realized it's a step-by-step journey. And some of us have psychological inclinations, and so I'm very grateful to be able to come together with like-minded Baba lovers and do this, you know, work on this psychological aspect as a way to get closer to him. And I have to keep repeating that, because it's not an end in itself, the psychological work. It's all for spiritual awakening. And I can see how much work has been done by all these Jungians and depth psychologists. And then there's Baba here, who's the ultimate reality. And I feel like over the next hundreds of years, we can bridge the gap and make it easier for those, you know, who do this work further down the road.
Yeah.
But it's kind of pioneering in a way.
And father-mother work, you mentioned.
Oh, yeah.
And my mother-in-law, who we have been taking care of in many ways for years, passed over 6 weeks ago or so. And I had a good relationship with her, but it has brought up for me my own father-mother work, and their passing, and the grieving and the acceptance, and it's such a provocative relationship. Those pesky parents, you know.
I lost my mom a year and 3 days ago, 2 days ago. It was just a year ago, and it's been, the whole year has been just like nothing but meditating on my karma, basically. And it's a really powerful process. Losing a parent is basically part of that process of shedding the ego that you're talking about, like that second half of our life process.
Right.
And I think that going forward, the next 100 years, like you're talking about, Anne, like this the field of psychology really needs to move forward with this idea of the subtle body, the subtle world, being an actual functional entity in people's psychology. The way, you know, like, if you can draw them a picture, like you guys like that picture I drew. I mean, I could draw 1,000 of them. The way our subtle bodies connect our mental bodies, our physical bodies, and interact with others. I mean, it's a very real phenomenon. What Meher Baba says, I think all of you guys accept that it's true, and that we just fail to understand it. So if psychology can move forward, it already has a lot of things that are not, what would you say, like quantifiable data? It's not quantifiable data, it's qualia that you guys deal in anyway. So if the paradigm could be more like, well, how's your subtle body today, Timmy? Like that. Maybe it would, maybe in 100 years. You know?
Yes, why not? And I mean, you're the next generation. You and Diantha are, you know, really.
In the Baba community, Mary.
Well, that's,
we're
yes,
47.
yes. But I mean, I feel the freshness that comes through you and your generation, because, you know, there's different generational coding or something. I don't know how to put it exactly, but I think it's so valuable to be able to, I so appreciate you as the younger generation who can bring some fresh awareness to this whole subject. It's really quite lovely.
The more lenses, the better. I mean, that's what it takes.
Yeah. Okay, Diantha, you haven't said anything.
Rosalie looks like she wants to talk.
Oh, well, all you have to do is unmute yourself.
Do I want to talk?
Oh, maybe not.
Maybe not.
Well, I'm thinking about it. I must say I'm very, very, very deeply into Bubba's mystical language now. And so it's interesting about talking it, you know, it's like, it's not intellectually understandable.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
I have a more prosaic thing I could mention that's related to this topic that's easy to talk about, and that is the shadow work. A lot of it for me could be easily done, I find, and I've been really consciously into Jung and doing shadow work my whole life. The easy part for me is like reading a good book or a movie, seeing a movie even that has a lot of strong archetypes in it, and really trying to identify with each one. And that is legitimately shadow work. I think Diantha and I were talking about this a couple months ago. We watched Stephen King's The Stand, which is a great book too for this, if you want to do this kind of work. But you really pay attention to those characters and try to put yourself in their shoes. And these authors have sort of done the shadow work for us. It is for sort of universal stuff they've done for us. It's great. So
yeah, no, that's such a valid point. Yes, I find that too. I love watching movies where I can identify the different shadows and just witness it, and you know, you get to see the outcomes, and it just supports the continuation of wanting to keep doing it, you know, the shadow work. Yeah.
I am still absorbing too everything that you said. I think a couple things that came up. Well, I like thinking about the collective consciousness too, about it all, so that so if I'm faced with shame, like you were experiencing that amount of shame with your daughter, and you kind of came around to thinking, well, maybe it's not just my individual shame, maybe it's the collective.
Yeah, well, I especially felt it through the female lineage for some reason. I tuned into a lot of stuff about my mother also. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So like intergenerational trauma and just collective trauma, things like that, or just changes that we want to make to consciousness as humanity in general, and how doing this individual work does reach that point, where it's actually being collectively helping.
Well, I just had a thought. Tell me what you think of this. That the thing I mentioned about the mothers and daughters, and how I had so many women coming to workshops and working on mothers and daughters. I think it's in the collective unconscious, where because for most of written history, it's been a patriarchal system where the femininity has been suppressed and relegated to an extremely limited and submissive role. I suspect that the shadows that live within us, really from this collective history, are in our unconscious. I mean, this is just part of my observation. And I spoke about this in the coronavirus Zoom session that I did last year, where I felt that I saw that it was an opportunity for everyone to get more in touch with the feminine aspect of their being, because we were forced to be at home, and it was more of a going within and being, and not so much active doing, which is what the masculine is so good at, whether it's in a male body or a female body. I believe the patriarchal system is so strong because so many women have over-identified with the masculine. So I feel like a part of the work of women is to embody the feminine qualities in a really powerful way. It's not weak. It's not weak to be feminine. It's like water, the water can just take anything, and it doesn't resist. There's no resistance. The water is emotion, and it can feel anything. And I think that's what the empowered feminine for both men and women is about, is just being open to feeling every emotion that hits us, because our emotional bodies are instruments with a purpose. And when we can process all of the positive and negative emotions, it just makes us so much more whole. And I don't know if I just went off on a tangent or not, but there it is. So Linda, I saw that you posted something. Do you want to just read it to us?
Sure. Yeah, when I was, I had a devastating personal tragedy a few years ago, and I went to India after just to hang out for a while after that experience. And I have, I've been visiting Meherabad, for many years. But anyway, I was at my root ashram near Ganeshpuri, and I ran across a book there that was the silent discourses of Meher Baba. And he was talking about on ego. And I wanted to hang myself, because I recognized the trap that I had fallen into.
Wow.
With my decades of spiritual work and service and seva. And when I saw the tricks of of just the self-preservation that went beyond into all my goodness, it was just too much for me. But it really made me more alert to what Meher was really saying, with his talk about if the ego can't get you on your bad points, because I'd already dealt with them. He was gonna go for the juicy, the good stuff, so to speak.
Yes.
It was really, I'm still reeling, but I'm starting to come to terms.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. I think our next session in 2 weeks, we're going to continue with the ego, because Baba talks about that very thing. Maybe that's the quote you sent us, but there was so much material, but he does talk about, and I think he talks about the trying to be good and building a spiritual ego. And I think Doug referenced that last week when he talked about the spiritual bypass.
Yeah.
And that is huge. It's huge. And that's like a subject for the next time, because there's just, as you can see there, Baba's given us so much. Yeah.
I'm sorry, you asked me to read it and I didn't, so I will read it quickly here. The ego is activated by the principle of self-perpetuation and has a tendency to live and grow by any and all means not closed to it. If the ego faces curtailment in one direction, it seeks compensating expansion in another. If it is overpowered by a flood of spiritual notions and actions, it even tends to fasten upon the very force which is originally brought into play for the ousting of the ego.
Mhm. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Oh,
So this
great.
is a huge subject, and I think that we'll spend more time on it. It's tricky business. It's just tricky business. But I find the opportunity to come together and share like this is so helpful. I can study on my own, but to have like a little study group, and I'm just so happy to research and give a presentation for the first half of the sessions. And then it's so rich for me to hear all of your experiences and thoughts and awarenesses. I think this is just a very ideal situation. And I would love to hear, we still have a little bit of time.
I just want to say thank you to Linda for sharing that specifically.
Yes.
That's something people don't talk about enough, because we all know Baba lovers who work really hard to look busy or look good or whatever. And you want to help them somehow. The only way we could do it is like share our inner shame of our own like failures in that department too. And like, I really appreciate talking about that. We should talk about it more. I agree, Anne, it's an important subject. So thanks.
Yeah.
Well, in hindsight, I try to figure out where I got so off, and a lot of it was not doing some somatic work, I think, to just physically pull out the trauma, that I was carrying in my subtle physical, because I did a lot of the right stuff all through the years, but I really that body energy mind integration, I certainly could have just, there wasn't much information, I think, about the somatic stuff, 20, 30 years ago, but there sure is now.
Yeah. No, I love that you bring that up. It's easier for me to avoid the somatic and the body. And yet I notice that it really helps. And then I think about how, Baba would go for walks and the Mandali would go for walks, and they don't overstress the body, but it's finding the balance, isn't it? Just to really to take care of this physical instrument, just so that we can give everything possible to be closer to Baba while we have the opportunity in the body, and then to make it better for the next time we're born. So where are you located, Linda?
I'm in Ventura County, near Los Angeles.
Oh, okay. Wow. I'm so glad you came and brought that very important aspect to the table here.
Thank you.
I did want to say something. When you mentioned, our identification with our parents. Well, before I met Mara, I had a dream, and I lived in Los Angeles and had the good fortune to be around Phyllis Frederick, was this just wonderful lover of God. And she loved to hear dreams. So she said I was looking to Mara as my mother. And so anyway, I remember meeting Mara. And when I met her, I didn't see anyone else. And I know she was not allowed to be alone. She always had to have someone with her, but it was inside the Samadhi. She used to come twice a month for Arti. I don't remember any other Mandali, but I could not believe this person was in a body with such depth. I didn't see how she was walking around. And I was really grateful to meet her in that way, because I knew why she was alive and living. She was just living for Baba. And so when I met her on the porch, it was this, you might say slightly social, but for me it was never social. It was like the strength I felt from her, the spontaneity, and the I had a very strong connection. She was the only Mandali where I didn't feel a personality.
Yeah.
As beautiful as Erich was, as beautiful as Mani was, they had Mani and Erich and Mara. It wasn't there. So that was unique for me. And it was like being with Baba because of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you. That is so beautiful, Rosalie. And it reminds me of the union of lover and beloved.
yeah.
She was the living embodiment of her pure attention
Yeah.
to Baba. Nothing else really existed for her. And so, Baba said, she is my very breath without whom I cannot live. And Diantha and I were just talking the other day about the different religions, the Shiva Shakti relationship. And so she and Baba represent that. That's like Ram Sita, Krishna Radha. She is the perfect counterpart. And I even think she's called original Maya. This is all deeply mysterious, and that could be a whole nother conversation, but thank you so much for bringing Mara up, because she really does represent the creation.
Oh, and it's also so interesting to me that he brought her for that accident where he wouldn't even let anyone disagree with her in the ashram, including Mani. Mani complained, and her corona's busted open, and here we have this thing with corona that's driving us inward. It's a real opportunity. I feel, the incredible grace of it.
Well, it's certainly easier than having a nuclear blast go off and blow up the planet.
Well, we don't really have a choice of outcomes here. It's like I don't like to worry about it, but I know that the part where Baba said 3/4 of the world will be destroyed, and I thought, you eat 3/4 of a pie or you don't eat 3/4 of a pie and you have a strong effect, but also along with that, the patriarchal thing, to see the strength of the matriarch, to see that strength that she had. She was highly creative after being so, constricted. I don't know how many people could have been under the restrictions that she had. It was like, almost like losing your sense of being a person, but I don't know if you've seen this, but there's a I didn't see it till recently, but there's a short thing where she's actually, because on the porch they didn't go to the accident. That was like, speak of something repressed, that was not talked about. But her memory is that Baba turned around and asked her, "Are you all right, Mara?" That was her experience. And it's so
that's
beautiful.
Probably what Andrew was talking about, the subtle body,
Yeah. And
definitely.
And she was Baba all right? It was like, it was like this incredible union, it was like, because because they never talked about it on the porch, it's just how it was, but
Well, thank you for sharing that. So amazing, the memory and bringing it here. I'm sorry I have to end the meeting now because it's 5:30, and I think other people are going to stay.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one question.
Thank you
And-
so much.
And
What?
what is your sign? Your astrological sign?
Well, I follow